Oh yeah, storm is bright. Can I get a whiteboard? Can I get a whiteboard? Can I get a whiteboard? Can I get a whiteboard?
Hello, this is Mrs. Rod. Welcome to Can I Get a Whiteboard? I am here today launching my new podcast. And for that, I am going to be interviewed by my husband, Dean Kern, who's going to ask me questions about my hopes and ambitions.
Well, why don't you start by telling us a little bit about yourself and why you chose the title, Can I Get a Whiteboard?
I began my career in education in 1999, but even before that, I have always worked with children. I've worked in daycares and after school programs. I've always enjoyed working with young people. But I've worked at the college level, began at the college level, and then I've worked at the middle school level and the high school level and the elementary school level, both in classrooms as an English teacher and in special education classrooms. And now I'm working as an administrator, and I chose the title, Can I Get a Whiteboard? Because a lot of times I'll walk into a classroom today and I might need to model a lesson or work with a student. And I'll look around and I'll say, can I get a whiteboard? And what I'll find out is that these whiteboards that are, to me, the pinnacle of the teaching technology. They were a wonderful step up from the chalkboard. You didn't have to wipe them down with wet cloths, right? These were a wonderful invention. And if they were magnetic, they were even better. You could stick things to them. They were just fantastic. And yet, we've taken these clunky smart boards and we've just pinned them right on top of these wonderful whiteboards. We've taken this big chunks of technology that half the time don't work, and we just plaster them on top of these whiteboards. And I'll go in there and then I'll hear from the teachers, actually, the smart boards don't even work anymore because the new computers aren't compatible with these smart boards, so you can't even use those effectively. Then I'll go to work with a student and I'll want to work with them on a whiteboard, but they'll only have Chromebooks. And so just when we want to get back to this idea of quality, good education, and a teacher working with a student, assessing their knowledge, helping them, getting them curious, engaging them in the process. And you can just do that with a whiteboard. I've said before, I'm like, I can pretty much teach them it with a whiteboard and a dry erase marker, and I can use a tissue to wipe it all off or my hand. I don't even need the eraser. But even that, sometimes we can't find this day and age when other things have become so cumbersome. And that sometimes feels like the case of what we're dealing with in the public education system right now.
It kind of feels like a metaphor for the public education system, the way you're taking one new piece of technology and covering over the last piece of technology, rendering it ineffective and useless.
Yes. And in the meantime, also not allowing what I think is the true foundation of education, which is that ability to communicate from a teacher to a student. There are roadblocks in the way of that. Software programs and computer companies trying to sell us our newest and greatest thing that are getting in the way of those kinds of relationships. And I think that is actually hurting and negatively affecting our public school systems. And you'll see this now that in Silicon Valley, where all these tech giants are, that in their schools, they want to get rid of technology because they understand that there is negative consequences to that technology being everywhere. And yet they want to sell us it and make all these promises about how it's going to help our students. It becomes something that disrupts the natural teaching rhythm and what teaching is about.
Well, I feel like that kind of leads into my next question, which is what are your goals for this podcast?
So, my goals with the podcast is to talk about tangible ways we can possibly push for change within the public school system. In West Virginia, we have a real crisis, but we are not the only state that is facing this. We nationally are having huge issues with retaining teachers, falling test scores, morale in terms of educators, in terms of students, in terms of families. I think we're at a national sort of tipping point within education. I've been thinking a lot about what we can do and how we can help. We can kind of sink and feel overwhelmed and feel helpless in the face of it, or we can try to be solution oriented and have really important, courageous, creative conversations about what could we change? What could we start at a very local level to implement creative new ideas and not be stuck in the same old patterns that seem to be leading us down a pretty bleak path.
Do you think that there are people or groups who are working to make public schools fail?
Yes, there are definitely groups and organizations who have been trying to weaken our public school system. And so they are attacking the funding structures. They are trying to push public sentiment against public schools. And there are organizations in West Virginia, we have an organization that is working with lawmakers called ALEC, which is the American Legislative Exchange Council. And they work with lawmakers and they've gone to other states. They rank the states that they consider the best in terms of voucher programs, in terms of having families that basically opt out of the public education system. Now, the interesting thing is the schools that they rank the best are often considered the poorest in terms of quality of education. So they think Arizona is great. Well, Arizona is near the bottom in terms of quality of education. They think West Virginia is pretty great. Again, we're near the bottom in terms of education quality. Now, I say this as a true blue West Virginian who was born and raised here, who went through the public school system, who graduated from West Virginia University, whose children have gone through the public school system. I have never felt a lack of intelligence or education because of the public schools in West Virginia and my experience here. There are incredible educators here. Just because we happen to be at the bottom of a list of quality of education, that to me does not reflect on the people that you will meet in these schools and the educators that you will encounter and their wealth of knowledge and their dedication to their craft. I think it speaks more to the poverty and the exploitation that our state has experienced and the incredible social obstacles that we face in terms of drug addiction, in terms of dying industries, and so on and so forth, that I'm not going to get into right now, but they are large and they are real and they do impact us and they have been going on for generations. What bothers me is that very financial vulnerability, that social vulnerability that West Virginia has seems to make us ripe pickings for these companies that want to come in and exploit that and use that weakness to therefore weaken us even further. That bothers me. So these organizations are really actively trying to financially dismantle public school systems. And what they do is they essentially champion voucher systems. And this weakens and weakens and weakens the public school system. ALEC and organizations like this are working from a corporate mindset. Their goal is to make money. They want to privatize school systems so they can make money. Think of them as the billionaires. All right, we're going to have private schools. We're going to pull students out of the public school system. We're going to weaken the public school system. And we're not necessarily going to give them good private schools. Then we get very strong, thinking, creative, curious kids who question and challenge the status quo. What they want is a fairly demoralized group of students who don't feel powerful, who feel like they just have to go along with things, don't feel like they can change the status quo. Historically, the rich and the powerful have always been scared of an educated working class. This goes back to the 1900s with Rockefeller, and he wanted to invest in schools, and he was very interested in them, but he only wanted the type of schools where students had to sit still, be obedient, and memorize, and that's all he wanted. He was quoted as saying, "I want workers, not thinkers." The late 1950s, we began investing in public schools again because of the arms race. And so we started spending more money on scientific exploration and more money on experimental hands-on STEM learning. And with that, people also began to be threatened by the public school system. The Title I program started, and we began giving money to schools where students lived in poverty. We began integrating our schools, and people saw those as a threat. And they said, what came out of that? Well, what came out of that was the women's rights movement. What came out of that was the civil rights movement, disabilities rights. All these people started rising up. Union organizations started to come out of that. And they said, whoa, what have we done? We've invested in this public education system that's really starting to make people push back and say, hey, we want rights. They don't want a working class. They don't want a public school system that really pushes people to think for themselves. It is in the rich people's best interest to keep a weak public school system. And this is part of what they're doing. This is part of their long term plan. And the primary way they do that is by pushing forth these voucher programs.
Wow, some of that's pretty far out there. You sure you're not being some kind of conspiracy theorist or
I am not a conspiracy
aluminum
theorist.
foil around the head?
You can go. There is a wonderful speech given by Paul Hardesty, who is the president of the West Virginia Board of Education. And he spoke about this. He spoke about ALEC, this American Legislative Exchange Council, and how they have come in and are working with certain lawmakers in Charleston. He's spoken about how we can see that the Hope Scholarship requirements fit on a postage stamp about this big, how the requirements for charter schools in West Virginia can fit on a piece of paper this big, and how all the laws and requirements for public schools fit into a text, into a book that's about this thick, and about how one of these has been set up to fail, right?
Could you explain a little bit about how the voucher programs and how the charter schools work?
Within West Virginia, the thing that's really created the biggest financial crisis within the public schools, I mean, we've always had economic issues in West Virginia. We are a poor state, but the voucher program has put this to a real tipping point. The first year we had the voucher system, which here is called the Hope Scholarship System, right? This is what it's called. With Hope, the first year, the public school system lost about $23 million students who took this scholarship. It was, I think the first year was 4,000 and some dollars per student. So instead of that money going into the public school system, somebody could say, I want to homeschool my kid, or I want to put them at a private school, and I'm going to use that 4,000 some dollars to put them into the private school, right? The next year, last year, we went up to $100 million. We lost $100 million in public school funding for people who wanted to pull their kids into a private school or to homeschool. Very few parameters. They could send them to private schools that were out of state. They could sign them up for swim lessons, dance lessons. These did not have to be academic lessons. There was hundreds of thousands of dollars spent on iPads. There were no limits on income. So families who would normally pay for private school themselves, and there were studies done that showed that most families who were already opting into private school and would have chosen that anyways also took the Hope Scholarship to pay for it. There were no income gaps or no eligibility related to income, which there usually are. West Virginia had not chosen to put that on as an eligibility requirement. None of those things were in place. This year, it's estimated that it's going to cost us $230 million that will be going out of the public school system into the Hope Scholarship system. And so there is a debate among the supermajority of Republicans that we have in the House of Delegates. And there are people, the House of Delegates hired a corporation called the RAND Corporation to do a study about how they can manage and rein in this Hope Scholarship and still afford to pay for a public school system. Because what's happening, we're having to close all these schools. We're having a huge teacher shortage because all the states surrounding us pay more than West Virginia pays as a salary. We have typically 1 in 8 positions in schools that are being filled by substitutes or they're vacant. We don't have teachers who really understand the material. In terms of special education, that's even worse in terms of specialists, reading interventionists. Our numbers there are even worse in terms of filling those positions. We're in this real financial dire situation. And particularly with these closures, you have to understand that this means that sometimes kids are on the bus for an hour and a half to be able to get to their local community schools. This means that this sense of community that was brought through their local school is gone. This has really been hugely impactful and really devastating in a lot of communities. So within this debate that's happening in the legislature right now, there are Republicans who are trying to put guardrails on the Hope Scholarship. They want to cap it about $5,250. They want to say that if you have a certain amount of money already, that you don't necessarily qualify to get the Hope Scholarship. They want to say that you can't spend it on schools that are outside of West Virginia. They want to put parameters on it to make it more for academic and curriculum-based materials. Another thing that Paul Hardesty talked about, the president of the West Virginia Board of Education, is that he talked about the funding formula for West Virginia public school students. And what he pointed out was that that is set by delegates, by senators in West Virginia. And in West Virginia, Per pupil, we don't differentiate between a special education student or a student in poverty or what we would call an average or normal student. Most states do. Most states would give extra money to a school who has special education needs. Because what's happening is most students who get the Hope Scholarship would go to a charter school and they would accept them if they don't have high needs because a lot of them don't have reading specialists. They don't have specialists who deal with kids who have disabilities. So the more average students are more likely to go to charter schools or be in homeschools. The high need students end up in the public schools. So this means we have higher poverty students, more of them. We have higher special education students, but we're getting just the same amount of money. And what Hardesty and others believe is that we should change that funding formula so that students who have special education needs, who are lower income, should get more money because they require more resources. And this is a kind of common sense way to approach funding schools based on students' needs. Because then again, once we're in the public school system, we suddenly are having less teachers because we have less students, but the students that we have much higher needs at a percentile level. So that's another factor that we have to think of through the funding formula of something like the Hope Scholarship.
So, where do you think there is room for hope?
I think there is room for hope in the sense that, one, I am hopeful that there are people in the House of Delegates in the West Virginia Senate who believe on putting guardrails on this Hope Scholarship. I'm hopeful, and I would encourage people to reach out to those people and say, please do this. We need this to keep our public school systems healthy enough to meet the needs of our high need students, of all our students. But I believe there's a lot of hope on thinking about the very local needs of our students in our school right here, right now. And how can we get them to still believe in our public education and get them to stay and continue to invest in our communities? Because most people who are teaching in West Virginia want to stay. They are here because they believe in it. They believe in our students and they believe that, they came here because they wanted to help these kids.
Such as yourself, you're fighting to stay,
Yeah, such as myself. I want to stay in public education.
even though you could go almost any direction and make more money.
Yes, I could go 20 minutes away and make significantly more money anywhere, around us. But I am, native West Virginian, and I believe that the neediest students deserve the best teachers. And not saying that I'm absolutely the best, but that's my belief system, and that's what I would like to operate from. And if we can make our public schools a place where educators feel empowered, where they feel like they can do some really important teaching and that their input was valued and that they weren't strangled by red tape and too much government oversight, I think we could offer them a working environment that would rival the financial incentives that are around them. And I think that's perhaps our greatest strength is if we tap into our parents, tap into our staffs, tap into our administrators and say, how can we wrangle back some power to really get back to what we believe is really good education and these meaningful relationships that we want to foster?
What government interference or red tape are you talking about?
The kind of government interference and red tape I'm talking about is kind of enormous. It's hard to
Hard to sum up, huh?
it's hard to sum up. So I'm just going to talk about one thing today because it goes from everything from behavior to attendance to anything you can imagine that affects a student's life and a teacher's life. There is red tape that usually goes with it. But I'm going to talk about things related to what is now the Third Grade Success Act, which is a law that has been slowly being enacted in West Virginia. It goes full into effect next year, the 2026-27 school year. And essentially, what it's saying is that students in third grade next year, if they don't meet mastery on the state standardized test in math or reading, they could be retained and have to repeat third grade. But with this has come all sorts of other consequences. Now, beginning at kindergarten, halfway through kindergarten, teachers are having to do progress monitoring and communicate to parents that their child is not making standard, 5.5 years old, that child is not making standard. And they have to communicate this and continue to communicate this up through third grade. So we are setting up what can often be a very fraught communication between schools and parents based on standards that many teachers don't even agree with or think are developmentally appropriate. And this also pushes families out of the public education system because they may rightfully think that their child just needs more time, needs more space, needs more room to be creative and explore their interests and not be under all this pressure to know these certain letters of their alphabet by the time they are halfway through kindergarten, when they are still learning how to have lunch in a cafeteria and all those types of things. So it's creating this enormous amount of pressure on the school system, on the students, and on the parents to have a level of conformity that feels incredibly artificial and that is incredibly stressful and really doesn't allow for differentiation among children, which is an incredibly important part of education, is that children are different and they learn at different paces. And these unrealistic expectations are harmful. One fact I thought was interesting that when we were looking at standardized tests as a whole, 70% of educators don't think standardized tests are developmentally appropriate for their age range that they are teaching. So this is from high school down to elementary school. There's also enormous amounts of research that says that the way you perform on a standardized test is directly related to your socioeconomic status of your family or your parents' educational level, or both. So the idea that a standardized test, which again, this all began with George Bush, 2002, No Child Left Behind. This government oversight began. We got the Common Core, all these things began. So the idea that you can measure a child and their growth through a standardized test instead of that relationship, again, that key relationship between the educator and the child, and understanding their growth and noting where they need support and being able to have that kind of communication and communicate that with that parent and having that kind of meaningful understanding of each other. The idea of that when we're looking at socioeconomics, so we understand that it's directly tied to the economics of it. And yet in West Virginia, 67% of our students qualify for free and reduced lunch across the state. So if we think 67% of our students essentially are marked for, an indicator of poverty. So it shouldn't be surprising that if we look at last year's data, if we imagine that the Third Grade Success Act had gone in effect last year, and we look at just our third graders and who possibly could have been retained last year, we are actually looking at 55% of third graders would have had to repeat third grade based on their reading scores. And then based on their math scores, we're looking at 47% of third graders would have had to repeat third grade. So can you imagine what this will cause for us? Half of all our third graders are going to have to repeat third grade. We're going to have to find more third grade teachers, more third grade classrooms. We're going to evidently have to give reading support for all these classes. And this is going to trickle down for years afterwards because this balloon grade level is going to then go on to fourth grade and so on and so forth. And then what's going to happen to those next set of third graders? Are we just going to have these incredibly ballooned classrooms? The illogic of this and the lack of planning that seems to be happening is enormous.
Because the standardized tests aren't actually designed for kids like the kids we have.
Yeah, for the types of kids who grow up in poverty. So we're setting ourselves up for a huge failure. And this isn't something that teachers advocated for or parents advocated for. This came from outside resources. This essentially came from people who are pushing it in Florida who decided this would be a good idea in West Virginia. And Florida is in a lot better economic state than we are. I do want to be upfront that I have cared about how my students perform on tests. And I have been interested in data, But I also don't believe in giving it too much weight because at the end of the day, we also have to understand the research, and the research indicates that this is not a reliable way to understand a student's achievement. And I know my students much better just through looking at their writing, through having conversations with them, through being with them day in and day out. I know them much better as a learner, as a scholar, and how they have developed in their thinking than I would ever know through a one-day test given once a year.
How do you feel like this is impacting teachers?
Now that we are having to progress monitor these students from midway through kindergarten up through third grade, this has brought, again, another level of red tape on the day to day lives of teachers. They have to now give a certain amount of minutes of intervention for students who are testing at the 25th percentile or lower. They have to put them on Chromebooks for a certain amount of minutes every week. So when they might be trying to provide interesting lessons about science, about how the world works, when they might want to allow students to have movement breaks or go outside and look at the trees, offer their students maybe more of the non-traditional learning that you might see in a homeschool environment or you might see in a private school, those teachers are having to do a minute by a minute accounting for their day. And that leads to a much more stressful environment, I think, for teachers. And again, that conformity of learning that takes some of the joy out of those day to day experiences as an educator. So I think it's demoralizing. And it feels again that teachers are being pulled further away from why they got into education in the first place.
And this is why teachers are quitting all over the place.
And I think this is part of the reason why teachers are quitting all over the place. They feel this incredible amount of pressure and under incredible amount of scrutiny. And even as administrators, if you try to protect them and you try to support them, it is still there in this day to day oversight that you could only limit so much. I think
So what do you think we might be able to do about this?
one of the things that I hope to do is to start conversations about how can we push back on this model? How do we start a conversation where we say, we want a kindergarten classroom. We insist upon a kindergarten classroom where students are allowed movement time. They are allowed time to go outside, to be exploratory, to be hands on. And how can we create that? Maybe we could have classrooms where we mix kindergarten and first grade. And so the standards that we would normally expect a child to meet by the end of kindergarten, we could push those off to the end of first grade. So it could be a combination of classes. So instead of saying that a child has to meet them by this deadline, if that child hasn't met that by that deadline, they just go out for reading at certain times. Because we know that reading, for example, doesn't always kick in until a child is 6 or even 7. Myself, for example, I was a late reader. I didn't even know this because I was homeschooled. So I had no one to compare it to. So now my mom tells me years later that I was late to start reading, but I had no idea. I didn't have to deal with that stress. My parents didn't have to deal with that stress. That was just something that evolved naturally. And then I became a voracious reader, and it was never an issue. So just giving children that time to learn, that time to breathe, I think as schools, we can say we want to try a different model. We don't want to be beholden to these intervention models. Our intervention is going to look different. It's going to look like this, right? The ways that we're going to pace our curriculum is going to be slightly different, and we're going to combine our English with our social studies. So we have more time to do outside of the box thinking and outside of the box curriculum. So we don't have to be locked into so many minutes. So I think there is room for creative restructuring of the day of a classroom, of the shape of a classroom. But I think it requires teachers and administrators and parents to all come together and say, we want something different, and to start having those conversations and say, we're gonna try it new. We're gonna try a new way to do this. And trying to fit into the mold of all this red tape in the traditional fashion isn't working for us anymore, and we want something new. Thank you all so much for being with me. I hope you enjoyed hearing my first episode of Can I Get a Whiteboard? I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day.